Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing all about why I like creating an underpainting for my watercolor pencil pieces using traditional watercolor paint. I'll be explaining the reasons why creating an underpainting can be very helpful in many cases when you're using watercolor pencils. And I'm also going to be sharing my best tips that are going to help you create a successful underpainting that you can then build on to create pieces that are unified, that are harmonious, and that have a glow to them. While I explain all of this, I'm also going to be sharing my process for this realistic watercolor pencil still life piece that I created last week. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So right around here, I am preparing to get started with my underpainting for this new piece, and I am just getting started with preparing my different colors, or my puddles of my different colors that I'm going to be using for my underpainting using traditional watercolor paint. This is from Daniel Smith. So for this one, because I wanted to create a nice warm glow coming from under the watercolor pencil pigment and the value work that I'm going to be developing via my layering of watercolor pencils, I decided to go with warm colors. I used Hansa Yellow Light, I used Yellow Ochre, and I used Burnt Sienna Light. And what you're seeing me do here after having done my pre-wetting with clean water is I started dropping in this color in different areas of my piece. These are just general loose washes of color that'll provide a base to work off of when I bring in my watercolor pencils. And then I allowed everything to dry completely, and it wasn't until everything was super bone dry and I helped myself with a hairdryer to speed up that drying process that I got started with the watercolor pencil process. And that's what you're going to be seeing me work on next, all of my layering with my watercolor pencils. Now, if you're interested in full watercolor pencil tutorials in which I walk you through my entire process for selecting my different colors in order to be able to develop a variety of values and realism and how I do my layering and color activation and whatnot, I would highly recommend checking out other tutorials that I've shared before. I'm going to make sure to leave links to a few of those down below in the description box in case you'd like to go and check them out. There is one full tutorial on natural scenery in which I did bring in that underpainting that I developed using traditional watercolor paint before getting started with the watercolor pencil process. I'll make sure to link to that below. But in the others, I didn't actually create an underpainting. So this underpainting process is kind of something new for me, and this is why I wanted to share this video today, because I'm finding them incredibly helpful and they create a very nice effect. And no, creating an underpainting is by no means necessary in order to arrive at successful or amazing results with watercolor pencils, but they do add an extra special touch. And they can even facilitate or speed up parts of the process depending on what it is that you're painting, which I'm going to be explaining more about in just a bit. Now that I've explained a little bit about the process that I go through to create my underpainting for a new piece, I want to briefly explain why creating an underpainting for watercolor pencil pieces can be so helpful, and not only for still life or scenery, but for a variety of different subjects that you might decide to tackle with this medium. So reason number one why creating an underpainting can be so helpful when you're using watercolor pencils is because they can really help you unify and create harmony in your piece. In past painting tutorials, I have talked about how color is an element of art that is super important and plays a huge role in making a piece look harmonious and cohesive. If we randomly pick colors throughout the painting process without having thought out or planned the specific color scheme or group of colors that we're going to be using for a piece, we not only run the risk of creating muddy colors or undesired colors, but also at the end, things are not going to look very integrated. And so by taking time to plan, to pre-select your colors and make sure that the colors work well together, there is much more of a chance that you're going to end up with something that looks cohesive and harmonious and visually pleasing. I always make time to pre-select and swatch out my colors and my color mixers that I'm going to be using for my pieces, and I try to keep my number of colors limited to only the amount of colors that I actually need. And I also make sure to repeat certain colors in different sections of my piece or in different color mixtures. And by that limiting of colors and that repetition of colors, that can also really help you create harmonious results. And the reason why this ties into creating an underpainting is because when you create your underpainting, you can use only one single color all throughout all of your different elements in your piece, or 3 to 5 colors, however many colors you want to use in your underpainting. I'd recommend limiting it as well. But these colors will be shining through from underneath all of these different elements or sections of your piece, which helps unify everything because you're going to have little bits and pieces of that color from your underpainting shining through certain sections of your piece. Moving on to reason number 2 why creating an underpainting can be so helpful when you're going to be working on a watercolor pencil piece. And this is because you're able to play with color temperature and provide your piece an interesting look. So for example, for this still life piece, I really wanted to create a warm glow coming from underneath all of the watercolor pencil work that I would be developing in all of these different elements. This is why I went with those warm colors for my underpainting. I wanted to have a yellowish hint in all of my lightest value sections throughout all of these different elements in my piece, including the elements that are inherently cool in temperature, such as the blueberries with all of those blues, that would provide a warmth all throughout the piece. Now, your underpainting doesn't have to be all warm colors or all cool colors. You can certainly have a mixture of warm and cool sections, but I would say that it is very important to give thought to what sections you actually want that warmth to shine through and where you want those cool hints to shine through. Moving on to reason number 3 on why creating a underpainting can be so helpful when working with this medium, and this is because it helps you speed up the process. So if you've ever created artwork with traditional colored pencils or watercolor pencils, especially if you're going for more of a realistic look, you know how time consuming it can be. It can take hours and hours to develop those different values, lights, midtones, and darks, and create smooth transitions, and do all of the layering that you need to do to deepen and darken darkest dark areas, and add in all of the details that you need to add in for something to look realistic. I personally find that the first layers of pigment that you are laying down are the most time consuming most of the time because you're covering up a good amount of paper and you have to make sure that you're laying down a good amount of pigment on that paper so that not too much of that tooth of that paper is showing through. And so you can imagine that by going in with actual watercolor paint and doing those quick washes of color, that is a way that you can start developing that color in a large area pretty fast without having to go in with pencil and manually fill up all of that. You can just go in with quick washes of color and water and a paintbrush. And then once that initial layer of color has been laid down for you and it has dried, now you can go ahead and start layering your watercolor pencil and building on top of that. Having a certain amount of color or a tint down for you can also make things less overwhelming when you're getting started with your layering of color. As you move on to your watercolor pencil work, you're not really looking to cover up lightest value areas because those are areas in which that underpainting and the brightness and the whiteness of the paper is shining through, remaining uncovered with your layering of watercolor pencil. This is why I don't ever use white with any of my watercolor pencil work. I don't need it because it is a translucent medium just like watercolor. And so I am using this translucency or transparency together with the whiteness and the brightness of the paper to create my highlights and my lightest values. So in darker value sections, I'm just layering the color more, covering up more of that paper, and in lighter value sections, there is little to no watercolor pencil in those sections. So I'm not actually looking to cover up those areas of my underpainting. You can just leave that underpainting shining through. And another thing is it can really help you speed up the process in terms of laying down or creating large washes of color. So say, for example, you are painting something like a landscape or any sort of scene that has a background to it. That can really be a pain and super time consuming if you go in and try to do it with watercolor pencils. Whereas you can just go in with traditional watercolor paint and lay down those quick washes of color in any large portions of your piece that you need to create or develop that color in, and not even go in with watercolor pencils in those areas. Just tackle that with traditional paint and then develop value more thoroughly and texture and detail in elements in the middle ground and the foreground using your watercolor pencils. And this is going to help you create a lot of depth and impact in your piece, and also is going to help balance things out in terms of leaving certain sections of your piece more painterly and having more of a sketchier colored pencil look in others. So because of all of those reasons, bringing in traditional watercolor paint can really help you speed up the process and also create more balanced, more impactful results at the end. All right, so moving on to the final reason why bringing in an underpainting can really be awesome for watercolor pencil pieces. And this is because it can help you create a painterly feel, a painterly look in some sections of your pieces, if that's something that you like. So for me personally, one of the awesome things that I like about watercolor pencils is that they are a drawing and a painting medium all wrapped up into one. And I talk much more in depth about the characteristics of watercolor pencils in that full Watercolor Pencil 101 video that I shared a while back. I'll also make sure to link to that class down below in the description box, because I talk all about the difference between traditional watercolor paint and watercolor pencils and provide a ton of super helpful information that if you're just getting started with watercolor pencils, you're going to find incredibly helpful in that video. But one of the many things that I love about this medium is how versatile it is and how it's a drawing and a painting medium all wrapped up into one. And so with this medium, we can create painterly effects and also effects that are more similar to traditional colored pencils. So a little bit sketchier, a little bit more textured. And what I like doing is balancing out the two, because if I didn't want any sketchy colored pencil textures, then I just go with traditional watercolor paint. And if I didn't want any painterly effects, then I just go with traditional colored pencils. So when I am using this medium, I like creating a balance between painterly effects and sketchier, more textured effects that colored pencils allow. However, I really like the quickness and the organic effects that traditional watercolor paint allows. And I find many of those effects and also working quickly hard to do with watercolor pencils. And so if you're also interested in creating a balance between painterly effects and colored pencil effects, I would recommend exploring the different effects that you can create by bringing in traditional watercolor paint, because I do find that even though watercolor pencils do allow for a certain amount of painterly effects, I'm always somewhat limited to what I can do. With traditional watercolor paint, you're going to be able to develop those painterly effects a lot more quickly and a lot more easily, and probably you're going to be able to create some effects that are going to be very difficult to do with regular watercolor pencils, such as beautiful gradients, wet on wet effects, blooms, that kind of thing that is very easily done with traditional watercolor paint. And then you can complement that with all of these great watercolor pencil effects and this detail and this precision and this control that watercolor pencils allow. Okay, so after having shared all of that, I'm now moving on to providing you 3 key tips that always help me create awesome underpaintings that I'm then going to be layering on top of using watercolor pencils. Tip number 1 is going to be to make sure that you're giving thought to the colors that you're using in your underpainting. So as I mentioned before, an underpainting can really help you create a nice unified effect as well as an interesting play with color temperature. And this is totally going to depend on the subject that you're painting as well as the effects that you're personally going for. But ask yourself if perhaps bringing in warmer hues or cooler hues is going to help you create the effect that you want, and is going to help you enhance the work that you do with your watercolor pencils. And I would also recommend keeping the number of colors that you're using in your underpainting limited to 1 to 3 colors. You really don't need much more. Give thought to the mood or the message that you're trying to transmit with your piece, the different colors that you're going to be using for the elements that you're going to be including in your composition, and what you personally feel will work best for the piece on hand, what you like best. Tip number 2 for creating a successful underpainting for a watercolor pencil piece is to not go in super heavy and saturated with your traditional watercolor paint. So if you go back to the beginning of this video, you're going to notice that not only did I pre-wet my watercolor paper with clean water before dropping in my color, meaning I created an initial layer of water on my paper before dropping in my color, which made that color look lighter because that water content that I prepared my paper with was added to the water content in my color mixtures. But I also made sure to just drop in a small amount of color at a time, and even did some lifting later using my clean and slightly damp paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge to remove excess paint, especially from lightest value sections. It's important not to create a very heavy, saturated underpainting. Keep your color nice and translucent, especially in the lighter value sections and the lightest light sections that you're going to be developing. Because as I said before, you want that whiteness and the brightness of your paper to shine through those lightest light sections. And if you go in super heavy and saturated with your watercolor paint for that underpainting, you're going to be covering those up, and you're going to be getting rid of those lightest values, and that is going to lead to heaviness and flatness. Remember that the whiteness of the paper is going to stand in place for your highlights, and if you're going for any level of realism, you need a wide range of values. You need your lightest lights. You cannot cover those lightest lights up because you're not going to be able to create that sense of dimension. So just make sure that you're creating your underpainting nice and light and translucent. You're just looking for a hint of color and a glow. And finally, tip number 3 is to make sure that as you move on to your layering with watercolor pencil, that you're not covering up lightest value sections, and that you're leaving light midtones and lightest lights free of watercolor pencil or with very little watercolor pencil in them. Those are sections where you want that underpainting to shine through, remaining uncovered with your layering of watercolor pencil. Essentially, the trick is to focus on doing the majority of your layering with watercolor pencil in darkest dark sections. So as you can see right here at this point of the process, I am almost done. The majority of my layering with my watercolor pencil is in darkest dark sections. And the sections of lightest lights and light midtones have very little to no layering of watercolor pencil in them. They have that underpainting shining through, and that whiteness and the brightness of the paper has been incorporated as part of the painting to help me create those lightest light values that I so very need to create that sense of glow and that sense of dimension. And this is essentially how I create a piece that has dimension to it, that has depth to it, that has a sense of realism, a level of realism that I personally like, and is still light and glowy and has an interesting play with color. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much, much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love, love, love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really, really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.